If stories have a message today, it often just tends to be one and the same message. Up to the point that people like The Critical Drinker here on YouTube have started simply referring to it as the message, as if there were only one. And I can't blame them, because every second new Hollywood movie that comes out seems to push this particular worldview. And, to make it almost hilarious, sometimes even markets it in a way as if this particular movie had been the first to espouse this particular message, when in reality the exact opposite is the case. The one message is pretty much everywhere you look. Or, if it isn't, there simply may not be any message at all. But why is it that storytelling has started to feel so stale today? Why does almost every movie or TV series we watch seem to be a reboot, a superfluous sequel, or, even if it is a new franchise, why does it still only seem to retread old ground and rehash the same old tropes, only with optional but frequent modern-day politics thrown in there for good measure? Hint, we haven't lost the plot, as they say, but we have lost track of pretty much everything else, starting with the characters and ending with a message. This video is a follow-up to my previous video, We Don't Need Gods, We Do Need Myths. But that was really more to explain why I consider stories and myths vital for society to begin with, and hence also why I started covering this topic here on my channel. If you already care about storytelling anyway, then I might not have to convince you of any of this first. So in that case, you might just want to start with the current video right away. In order to prevent this video from becoming as long as my last one, I'll have to split this up into two parts. In this present video, I first want to explore where the message comes from, or rather, why it seems to have captured such a large portion of our entertainment today that the only options we seem to be able to choose between are the message or no message at all. If you've seen the previous video, We Don't Need Gods, We Do Need Myths, hopefully you'll see why I don't think that simply doing away with messages in movies altogether is a viable option to improve storytelling going forward. It would merely get us to a state of freedom from, that is, freedom from obnoxious preaching, but it would utterly fail at giving us a freedom to, that is, the freedom to act within the world with proper guidance without being lost to such an extent that this freedom feels like chaos. In the next video, I'm going to link this to the character archetypes we see today and why some of them work while others don't. Specifically, why does there seem to be a particular challenge with writing female characters these days? Why have some of them succeeded at appealing to a wider audience, while others have been widely rejected, mocked and ridiculed? Sure, the message may play a big role in that, as it comes with certain taboos that make it hard for a female character to fail at, or even just struggle with, anything. But the problem goes way deeper than the mere feeling of forbidden thoughts. I for one actually think you cannot just take a strong character and then just happen to make them female. There are certain tropes that work with male characters, but that simply won't translate well to female characters, and vice versa. Some of these reasons may be sociocultural, yes, but at the end of the day, culture is just a function of biology. The majority of the reasons for why some tropes are specifically male or female can ultimately still be retraced to evolution. But before we can get to those questions in the next video, we first need to understand why the majority of our stories today seem to always come from the same one side of the political aisle. It has been well documented that there is a correlation between two of the big five personality traits, conscientiousness and openness to experience, and political affiliation. Progressives tend to be low in conscientiousness, that is, undisciplined, but high in openness, which is linked to creativity. Conservatives tend to be high in conscientiousness, but low in openness. Right there you have the explanation why most artists tend to be left-leaning, not just movie makers, but also book authors, musicians, painters, dancers, and many more. So naturally, a lot of the messages contained in stories will also be selected by progressives. And if the progressive community gets hijacked by what used to be a fringe ideology, but that has worked itself up to become the new left-wing mainstream via means of social pressure, then all of these creatives become more prone to adding varying degrees of woke ideas into their stories. But that alone doesn't explain yet how these left-wing messages made it all the way to the top, into the largest and most popular franchises. Because simultaneously, this split depicts one reason why a lot of creatives fail, and why there are a lot of starving artists as a result. Being low in conscientiousness but high in openness suggests that a lot of artists may have the creativity to come up with new ideas, but lack the discipline to put them into practice, and see a project through all the way to the end. Brandon Sanderson claimed that the share of people who start writing a book but don't finish it were much higher than the number of people who finish writing a book but don't get published. Gatekeeping by publishers and executives or music labels, sure, that is one obstacle standing in an artist's way, but the biggest obstacle seems to be within ourselves. There's only 24 hours in a day for each of us, and especially if you start out being creative while still having a day job, a lot of people might simply find themselves running out of energy before they can finalize their creative vision. And even if they do finish their work and manage to publish it, thanks to self-publishing it's even easier than ever to circumvent the problem of industry professionals gatekeeping you, then from those who made it that far, some may run out of energy in their efforts to promote and advertise their creative product. Jordan Peterson claimed that, for example, out of 80 million songs, 70 million get downloaded 0 times. Against that background, I can really be happy for every one of my own songs here on YouTube that reaches triple-digit views. So even when creatives do build up some discipline, while that may be a necessary criterion for success, it is still by no means a sufficient criterion for success. Of course, being aware of this brute fact can in turn establish a negative feedback loop, where a lot of people with creative potential don't even muster the discipline to finish their story in the first place. Because after all, there is no guarantee that all of this effort will be rewarded in the end. And conversely, if you are conscientious enough to possess that level of discipline, that will often also correlate with you preferring clear hierarchies and a daily routine. In a lot of creative jobs, however, such clear hierarchies and routines don't necessarily exist. Every day is a new adventure, and you can't actually rely on your efforts paying off simply because your environment is so unstable and unpredictable. As a result, more conservative types have little incentive to venture into creative fields because how work is often being approached in these domains will rarely line up with their personal preferences. Entrepreneurs, meanwhile, and most full-time authors being self-employed obviously fall into that category, tend to score high in both conscientiousness and openness. By mere virtue of self-selection, people with those personality traits are more likely to become entrepreneurs, but also entrepreneurs need both of these traits to be successful. They need to combine the necessary creativity to come up with something new, with the discipline to put it into practice, and stick with the project until its completion. Therefore, I'd expect most of these disciplined creatives to have a libertarian mindset. They should understand that they are solely responsible for realizing their creative vision through putting in whatever number of hours it takes to get there. At the same time, they will value the personal autonomy that frees them up to pursue this creative vision, and will refuse to be constrained by the status quo or the old way of doing things. Entrepreneurs also seem to score lower in neuroticism and agreeableness, even when compared against managers. If you add these four expressions of the personality factors together, I think we end up with a pretty coherent picture of the type of messages that especially American movies used to contain for a very long time. And even nowadays, a lot of them do, even the progressive ones. For example, in my previous video, I cited Glee as an almost meme-like example of what many of the current-day progressive values seem to be all about. And the attitudes of the characters in that show go along with the mindsets depicted here to quite some extent. With the exception of the low neuroticism maybe. Many of the characters in Glee tend to be more on the emotional side, some of them being drama queens in every sense of the word. And here we may have a potential connection to narcissism, and its confirmed positive correlation to social media use. According to a meta-analysis by McCain and Campbell, it's specifically grandiose narcissism that's linked to time spent on social media, not so much vulnerable narcissism. Paul Hu suggested in 2001 that narcissists should be high in extroversion but low in agreeableness. They are sociable, but their primary incentive to socialize is to elevate their own status, if need be at the expense of others. Note that not all studies find such a correlation between narcissism and agreeableness, though. If narcissism is already being fostered in the normal population thanks to social media, if you then go into a self-selected bubble of celebrities like Hollywood, it would not surprise me if narcissists are overrepresented there. In general, you'd expect dark triad-types, that is, narcissists, Machiavellians, and psychopaths, to be overrepresented in positions of power and influence. Narcissists have an inflated ego on the outside, but their self-esteem on the inside is actually pretty volatile. It's a high tower with a weak fundament. That's why they're great at dishing out criticism, but terrible at taking it. So if you're wondering why incompetent film producers and writers would rather attack the fans than to admit they were the ones who messed up, well, that's just what narcissists do, and social media does indeed seem to be creating more of them. So much for the origins of the political slant to the left among writers. Ultimately, a lot of this will be down to self-selection, just like people with conservative attitudes, such as law and order types, will be overrepresented among police officers and in the military. But even when by mere virtue of self-selection, our stories will frequently come with a certain ideological bias to them, that issue is separate from, and therefore no excuse for, lazy writing. In fact, if you tell a competent story, people may actually let you get away with even heavy-handed political messaging and symbolism. The Boys, for example, continues to be massively popular within the fandom menace, even though it's a cynical subversion of the beloved Marvel superhero movies, deconstructive and critical of the work that came before it. On paper, this looks like a very similar setup to Disney's Star Wars or Kurtzman's Star Trek, intentionally going out of their way to dismantle the work of fiction their own is based on. And if you listen to the writers and producers of The Boys in interviews, you'll quickly realize they're pretty much as woke as everyone else around them. In hindsight, I actually wish I hadn't listened to or read any of those interviews, so that the symbolism in the episodes would have remained more ambiguous to me. That way, what they were actually trying to say would have been left up to my imagination. Sadly, writers who also regard themselves as activists often can't help themselves in interviews. They feel like they simply must jump at every opportunity to tell everyone what their story is about, rather than simply allowing the story to show it by itself. It's show don't tell for a reason, not show and tell. The latter can often feel like a magician giving away his tricks, or like a comedian explaining his jokes. But at least with competent writers, like those working on The Boys, at the end of the day, they are still writers first, activists second. In stark contrast to the deconstructive criticism, there are movies that go for straight up nostalgia bait. I could have put the other two Disney Star Wars movies in here, episode 7 and 9, but since both of them basically just work with an entire vineyard full of member berries, I thought that would simply be the most accurate representation. These movies don't seek to subvert or question what the original source of inspiration did. The main thing they're aiming for is merely to replicate the magic of watching the original for the first time. Of course, this hardly ever works, unless the original is so unknown that most audience members are encountering the story for the first time anyway, and the included member berries are merely for the few diehard fans of the first generation. A positive example of pure nostalgia would be the Orville, which, in the eyes of a lot of fans, actually comes closer to recapturing the spirit of Star Trek The Next Generation than what is currently being released under the official Star Trek brand. While the Orville is of course set in a universe of its own, with new planets, new species, new characters, it still draws so much from Star Trek as a single source of inspiration that, if you did this in an academic paper, it would probably qualify as plagiarism. The Federation is the Union, the warp drive is the quantum drive, the holodeck is the environmental simulator. Sure, you can come up with new names to replace the old ones all day long. That's a well-known tool to turn something that used to be fanfiction into original fiction of its own. But if you've drawn so much from just one single source during the creative process, it will still inevitably show up in the end product. Not even the ship design has been updated to our current level of science. Rotating ring habitats to create artificial gravity from centrifugal force? Nope. The Orville still has the same stacked deck structure as the Enterprise. The uniforms look very akin to Star Trek 2, and for added hilarity, several of the original Star Trek actors have been guest stars on the show. Or conversely, the ship doctor of the Orville was a recurring cast member on Star Trek Deep Space Nine. On the plus side, it's somewhat reassuring for creatives that you can lean so clearly and heavily on another work of fiction that you can even be openly and unashamedly derivative of it, and apparently still not face any lawsuits. Because for all I know, Seth MacFarlane may have thought about buying the rights to official Star Trek, but he doesn't actually own any portion of them yet. And seeing how popular the Orville is with fans, especially compared to what passes as official Star Trek these days, Amazon and Paramount would have every incentive to at least attempt to sue him, if only out of jealousy. The closest thing we got recently in terms of a sci-fi series that was updated to match the current state of the science, and thereby give audiences more reasonable expectations for a future in space than Star Trek with all of its utopian idealism, is of course The Expanse. At the same time, because its setting lacks that utopian idealism of Star Trek, it also has much less inspirational potential than Star Trek, or even the Orville, at least for me personally. While the writing is obviously infinitely superior to modern-day Star Trek, the dark, gritty and dirty atmosphere of the scenery, especially in the Belt, still makes it visually similar to the sets of, say, Star Trek Picard. This also applies to the ship and costume design, in the sense that I don't find any of them particularly memorable, neither in The Expanse nor in Star Trek Picard. The Orville may have shamelessly ripped off the Next Generation uniforms, but hey, at least I can clearly visualize them before my inner eye. And actually, despite their obvious source of inspiration, the Orville uniforms are actually still visually distinct enough from those of the Enterprise that I don't even need to see them side by side in order to have a clear mental image of them. Sometimes you only notice how important something is when it's absent, like the bass in a piece of music. As long as it's present, you don't consciously notice it, you simply take it for granted. And one of those factors, the importance of which became apparent to me through its absence, was indeed that a story should have a clear visual identity and iconography, be it costumes, or vessels, or tools that characters frequently use, symbols that are presented frequently, quotes, catchphrases and idioms that characters recite repeatedly, and so on. These symbols are part of the way of life of the subculture that is the fandom of a given story. Members of that fandom recognize each other by the fact that their fellow citizen recognizes these symbols. And woe be to those who mix them up. That's like extremely culturally offensive. Finally, there are movies that focus so heavily on their plot, with the themes either being non-existent or so far in the background, that you might as well call them popcorn cinema. This is of course perfectly fine, as temporary fast food entertainment, as long as the movie is self-aware and humble enough to admit that this is all it's doing. Nothing kills the mindless fun of escapism full of CGI bluster and snarky humor faster than some knee-jerk heavy-handed messaging or some pretentious and supposedly deep wisdom that is actually just a truism and probably got forced in there at the last second, despite not resonating with or even actively going against the theme that naturally emerges from the story. I've put Avengers Infinity War in here as a competent example because I think it's hard to argue with the level of success this movie had. Nevertheless, I've outlined in my video metaphorical truths of well-being, why I personally don't actually consider Infinity War or Endgame particularly good movies. The most interesting character in Infinity War, by a long shot, is Thanos, the villain. Compared to him, none of the heroes get enough screen time to be properly fleshed out. Sure, some of them, like Iron Man, Thor and Captain America, got several dedicated movies for themselves. Others didn't. But you can't simply front-load all of the character development of your heroes and then have little to none of it left for the finale. Also, even Captain America Civil War already featured an excessive number of characters, so for all intents and purposes, it was effectively just another full-blown Avengers movie. Back when I watched Civil War, I already thought they couldn't possibly include any more heroes in one single film. And then I saw the posters for Infinity War, or as it should probably be called, Kitchen Sink the Movie. It's a classical example of style over substance, quantity over quality, when less would probably have been more. Finally, with Marvel specifically, there has always been the inclination to throw a lot of the story's potential gravitas out of the window in exchange for a quick and cheap joke by one of the characters. Overly sarcastic productions have just done a video about that, finally giving me the vocabulary to accurately verbalize why the MCU movies have resonated with me much less than, say, the Spider-Man and X-Men movies from the early 2000s. This storytelling device is called lampshading, as in having a character put a lampshade over an object that isn't supposed to be in the scene, thereby showing that the authors themselves are aware of the problem. And bathos can be used to describe the sudden shift in tone from serious to ridiculous, by disrupting the tense atmosphere of a high-stakes combat or negotiation with some random witty one-liner. For example, in Captain America Civil War, when Spider-Man goes up against Ant-Man, of course I as a viewer immediately thought about the snowspeeders attacking the AT-ATs in Star Wars The Empire Strikes Back. And a second later, Spider-Man within that scene points out this exact similarity of the situation. It may be funny in the moment of watching, but it also breaks the fourth wall and reminds you, the viewer, that you are still watching a movie after all. More importantly, Marvel in particular uses jokes in such excessive amounts that they can often even undermine the severity of the serious scenes in a given movie. Even when you have world-threatening villains like Thanos, it's hard to believe as a viewer that the fate of the entire universe is at stake if the characters are still joking around all the time. Perhaps in some cases, this is supposed to demonstrate that these superheroes are stoic and serene, not easily upset. But there is a difference between gallows humor, such as Han Solo pointing out in the trash compactor that they're all gonna be a lot thinner, but the viewer still realizes that even Han Solo is merely trying his best to stop himself from panicking, and characters who are so non-stop witty that it stops you from taking the threats they are facing seriously. Jokes can serve at least two different purposes in a story. In Han Solo's case, it's to show something about a character. Namely, that he's using sarcasm and gallows humor as a stress relief to help both himself and others cope with the dire situation. Han Solo is making the joke primarily for his comrades. Spider-Man in Civil War, in contrast, makes the joke for the audience. And when an MCU movie uses a joke in the midst of a serious scene, sometimes it does indeed seem like it's intended as a stress relief for the viewers, so that the severity of the situation doesn't pull at their heartstrings too much. When push comes to shove, it often seems like Marvel movies would rather see the audience entertained and amused than genuinely moved by what's happening on screen. And this, alongside the CGI overload, is one of the primary things that made a lot of the MCU movies feel fast food-like and forgettable to me. Because that short laugh you get out of yet another stupid joke has a much more shallow emotion than when you see Spider-Man at the end of the first Sam Raimi movie finally acknowledging Uncle Ben as his father. Thus, it ultimately seems like MCU movies aren't supposed to be remembered. They're supposed to be consumed and forgotten, to free up your mental stomach for the next MCU installment, which is always just around the corner. The movie adaptation for The Wheel of Time, meanwhile, at several points committed the classic mistake that a lot of plot-heavy stories with rich world-building are prone to: infodumping. Lots of words, lots of facts about the fictional world, and yet not a single reason to care about any of it. Overwhelming the audience with a truckload full of background information, myths from within the setting, and or part of its history, talk about MacGuffins that must be acquired to fulfill a certain lap of a quest, and so on. A MacGuffin is a plot device, often an item, sometimes a location or a character, that acts to give the characters an incentive to embark on the mission. It is therefore of supreme importance to the characters within the story, but it has no real-world counterpart for the audience watching, and is therefore not directly relevant to the viewers. Even in The Lord of the Rings, it's not actually the ring itself you care about. You care about the struggles Frodo and Sam have to go through on the way to Mount Doom to destroy it. And the ring itself isn't even necessarily what the story is about. It's about what the ring represents. For example, the temptations of greed and power. If, however, you bury the symbolic significance under layers and layers of random information about the backstory and setting, you're giving the audience a whole lot of stuff to memorize without giving them any clue what parts of this whole infodump are going to be relevant anymore when the story reaches its climax. Even worse, sometimes these infodumps occur in the form of characters monologuing about the backstory in question. In other words, you don't actually get to see the events play out on screen, you only see a character telling you about them. Even though a movie, in contrast to a book, would have the option to actually film the flashback scene. But of course, merely having one character talk about the whole event is an easy way to save money instead. In the Wheel of Time TV adaptation in particular, the task of infodumping was often given to Moraine. But any type of sage or mentor character will do, because it's plausible to assume that they know more about the intricacies of the world than the main characters, acting as a window for the viewer to explore that world together with them. I see two main reasons why writers fall into the trap of infodumping. One, they've spent all this time building a fictional world with all these places, history and characters that they want to show off as much of it as possible. but just because you can show that much of your world doesn't mean you should. Especially in the beginning, again, less is often more. Once you've succeeded at making people care about your characters, they will be much more open to learning more about your world and its backstory. Second, and this is on a related note, but also connected to what I said about narcissism and social media earlier. Nowadays, it's easy to find people on the internet who are indeed intimately familiar with the world and backstory of their favorite stories. Sometimes you even get the feeling these fans have memorized more of this knowledge by heart than even the author of the story him or herself. And of course, if you are an aspiring author, there may be few things more fulfilling than to have those enthusiastic fans nerd out about the setting you have created with the same level of dedication. Some delusions of grandeur of this kind may be necessary to motivate writers to even finish their work. Dare to dream big, so that you have a lofty goal that pulls you forward. That said, seeing all of these expert fans online can lead some authors to assume that there are people out there who just live for world-building facts for the sake of it. But I don't think that's actually what's happening. Again, people need to care about your characters first before they start caring about your world and plot. You don't start memorizing the formulas for a bunch of Harry Potter spells unless you already know about Harry, Ron and Hermione and why you should care about their struggles, even if you can't exactly put your finger on that why. Of course, excessive info dumping is just one of many mistakes that a writer can commit. We haven't even started talking about the character work yet, because that, as announced in the beginning, will require a dedicated video of its own. So when you see professional Hollywood writers commit what can basically only be regarded as rookie mistakes, and we then observe a correlation between incompetent writing and ideological inserts into stories, the question is, what is the cause, what is the effect? Do we have a dynasty of incompetent writers who simply fail their way to the top by engaging in some good old nepotism, and then add woke ideology to the story after the fact, in order to distract from their incompetence and use a diverse cast as human shields against any criticism? Or do we have people who have an ideological goal first, and the goal of telling a story only comes second, so that whenever a decision has to be made between what serves the story versus what serves the ideology, ideology trumps good storytelling? This is something we will have to assess on a movie-by-movie basis. Sometimes a studio may choose less well-known writers, or give them too short of a deadline to create something worthwhile, merely out of an effort to save money. Then those writers come up with a subpar product, especially when it's a whole team of writers that cannot agree on a common creative vision, but can only come up with something matching the smallest common denominator. And then, in an effort to defend this subpar product, given how much money has already been poured into it, human shields in all colors of the rainbow are required to deflect the criticism. Conversely, sometimes a movie producer will have an ideological axe to grind, and therefore they will either hire people specifically for sharing their worldview and or for possessing certain demographic characteristics that appeal to this worldview. In that case, we are more likely to end up with someone who is an activist first and a writer second. Both mechanisms each contribute their share to perpetuating that one message in the creative community. And ultimately, because it seems to be everywhere, and so many creatives are already endorsing it, even standalone authors who are not forced to do the bidding of any Hollywood executives still write their self-published books in the same woke spirit as those Hollywood films, if only because of the peer pressure of their fellow creatives from their respective social media bubble. So with all this out of the way, I think we have at least somewhat of an understanding why the creative community at large, not just in Hollywood, but also among hobby and self-published authors here on YouTube for example, have been infiltrated by wokeness. And why, as a result of that, we're pretty much only seeing minor variations of one and the same core message across the board. If you're curious about what other types of messages we could start including in stories, including ones that are controversial or haven't been portrayed on screen that often yet, I've elaborated on that in my video Metaphorical Truths of Well-Being. And if you wonder why we even need messages in stories, or why it isn't possible to tell a good story without one, you can check out my previous video, We Don't Need Gods, We Do Need Myths. In the next part, we're going to have a look at different types of characters, why we care about some and are bored by others, and why the specific challenge with writing female characters is about more than just taking the template for a male character and swapping out the chromosomes. For reference regarding everything I said in the first part of this video, here are some personality studies that I resorted to in order to read up on the connections between the Big Five and the factors of interest we've discussed. Of course, a lot of us will have first heard about these correlations through Jordan Peterson, but if you want to read about these findings yourself, these are possible sources you could go to. So as always, feel free to disprove my claims in the comments down below, and see you all next time.